Every legend has a beginning, but for the fantasy land of Hyrule, the beginning wasn't always so clear. Before the series' popularity tapered off near the 2010s, there was a time when The Legend of Zelda was considered a titan of the video game industry, and all throughout the height of its popularity, its most hardcore fans found themselves embroiled in the same point of discussion, known simply as the Zelda timeline. The series' ambiguous chronology was once the subject of infamous debate. As the series kept receiving new entries on an almost yearly basis, its chronological order only grew more unclear. While some games were clearly poised as sequels to other entries, these emerging groups of connected Zelda games had overall less obvious connections to each other. There wasn't a universal method of organizing every game into a unified timeline, and die-hard fans all had their own idea of which interpretation made the most sense. Though the series' own creative leads occasionally alluded to the existence of an official timeline, they were content to keep the timeline a secret to everybody, leaving fans to piece the puzzle together for themselves. That's largely the reason why the Zelda timeline became such a contentious point of discussion to begin with. Despite all the endless debates and theories, it was a puzzle never meant to be solved. Or so everyone thought. In 2011, Hyrule Historia was released in Japan, an official compendium of artwork, interviews, and information related to the entirety of the Zelda series. The book commemorated the series' then 25-year anniversary. Though nowadays, Hyrule Historia is perhaps best known for declassifying the official Zelda timeline, putting all long-standing debates to rest. A measly 2 pages of information were enough to instantly undercut and invalidate years of online discussion. This was to say nothing of the newly revealed timeline, which itself became a contentious point among fans. Fans were split between those who felt the reveal of a third timeline branch was without any logical narrative basis, and those who simply took the timeline at face value, accepting it as canon. After all, now that the series' official chronology was made public, even thinking about the Zelda timeline any further was pointless. Why bother when there was now an official timeline that superseded all fan theories? When you get down to it, the official Zelda timeline was the only one that mattered now. While it's quite easy to reach that conclusion from a cursory glance, a closer look between the lines tells a different story. Though it's indisputable that the Zelda timeline established in Hyrule Historia is recognized as official by Nintendo themselves, there's reason to believe that it shouldn't be treated as the definitive authority of the series' chronology. Yes, the mere existence of an official Zelda timeline would suggest otherwise, but evidence present within various developer interviews, the games themselves, and even Hyrule Historia itself all point to this official timeline simply not being relevant to the series. The total sum of evidence tells the story of an unwavering development team, one who recognizes the appeal of a definitive chronology, but has never bound themselves to it. While many have chosen to simply take Nintendo's official Zelda timeline at face value, this video aims to examine the timeline from an alternate perspective, thereby posing the question, has the Zelda series really changed as a result of demystifying its own chronology, or otherwise justified the existence of an official timeline? To address the frankly loaded nature of that question, this video will be focused on 3 key points supporting this claim that the official Zelda timeline doesn't matter. The Zelda series' overarching story and mythos haven't benefited from the reveal of an official timeline, nor has the narrative focus of each game changed in any meaningful way as a direct result of it. The Zelda series' creative leads have historically avoided focusing on how a new entry should fit into the timeline during development, for fear that rigidly adhering to their own chronology could limit the creative potential of the series' gameplay. The Zelda team has openly and continuously encouraged fans to reach their own conclusions regarding the internal history, chronology, and lore of the Zelda series, even to this day. But understanding these points first requires a clear understanding of why exactly the Zelda timeline became so infamous to begin with. Practically every other series with a continuous story has their own timeline of events, so what made the Zelda timeline worthy of such debate to begin with? The reason is largely owed to each new entry being designed under the assumption that it could serve as a feasible entry point for newcomers. Even though The Legend of Zelda has historically stood as one of Nintendo's most narrative-driven series, almost every installment has been carefully designed to work as a standalone, self-contained adventure. Even in the case of entries clearly poised as direct sequels, the stories in each of these games, with the possible exceptions to Zelda 2 and Tears of the Kingdom, can still stand on their own without strong narrative ties to their predecessor. While a game like Spirit Tracks is an obvious sequel to Phantom Hourglass, itself a sequel to Wind Waker and Ocarina of Time by extension, the events of those games have little bearing on the story told in Spirit Tracks. It's a completely different adventure, written and designed in such a way that newcomers wouldn't be alienated if it was their first exposure to the series, and Spirit Tracks is far from the only game in the series written in such a way. When past events are referenced, they're often spoken of as distant myths or otherwise casually mentioned in passing. Accentuating this is the vague, varying amount of time between each entry. Even Tears of the Kingdom, easily the most direct sequel in the series, doesn't clearly establish how much time passed since Breath of the Wild. These vague gaps between entries not only gives the Zelda team more freedom on where they can plausibly set new games, but conveniently double as perfect picking for fan speculation. While this narrative approach keeps the series accessible for newcomers, it consequently makes the actual connections between certain entries harder to pin down. One would imagine that had the Zelda team anticipated future plot threads like time travel, they might have considered establishing a more interconnected, overarching narrative from the very beginning. But as the Zelda team kept their focus towards building upon the series' gameplay, its expansive mythos and chronology was something that slowly developed in the background, partially as a side effect of this focus on self-contained stories. Since crafting an overarching narrative clearly wasn't Nintendo's original intention, the Zelda series' wider chronology is left ambiguous, because the games rarely concern themselves with establishing a definitive timeline. Though this narrative approach is hardly unique, as most other series have such a strong sense of continuity that most mentions of prior events can be easily cross-referenced. But that's not always true for Zelda. Ultimately, what makes the concept of the Zelda timeline so unique is that while each game centers around its own story and mythos, they all take place somewhere in the history of the same world. In spite of this, they never try to be different episodes of a grand, interconnected saga meant to tell the history of Hyrule. Each game is sooner its own legend than it is part of some grand epic. Through their efforts to sort these games into a cohesive timeline, dedicated fans were actively trying to introduce structure to a series that had a very tenuous narrative foundation overall. While it was Nintendo who established that foundation, it was the fans who saw fit to build upon it by filling in the gaps of Hyrule's history themselves. With every bit of in-game information serving as evidence for such theories, it's possible to come up with dozens of different ways these games all link together. And in this sense, many entries in The Legend of Zelda are inherently modular and could be argued to take place at any point in Hyrule's history. Not only is this a large part in why there were timeline debates to begin with, but it's exemplified by Nintendo's own official timeline. In the page preceding the Zelda timeline shown in Hyrule Historia, a short preface can be found, written using extremely non-committal language.
There is evidence that the story of The Legend of Zelda begins with Skyward Sword. This chronicle merely collects information that is believed to be true at this time, and there are many obscured and unanswered secrets that still lie within the tale. As the stories and storytellers of Hyrule change, so too does its history. Changes that seem inconsequential could evolve at some point to hatch new legends, and perhaps change this tapestry of history itself.
For a book openly marketed as the definitive chronicle of the Zelda series mythos, Hyrule Historia is quick to undercut its own status as such. Though one could argue this phrasing is meant to give the Zelda team some creative leeway by establishing they could later revise the timeline to accommodate future releases, an argument actually supported by a more direct translation of the same passage in Hyrule Historia's Japanese release. However, the same translation also emphasizes how Hyrule's history can change based on the person telling it, highlighting an apparent desire for fans to piece the chronology together for themselves. The English release of Zelda Encyclopedia in 2017 seems to support this message, as it features an updated timeline that slightly differs from Hyrule Historia, with a short blurb of text that states,
"The timeline can be interpreted in a number of ways, and may change depending on new discoveries that have come to light and on the player's imaginations."
If the entire purpose of an official timeline is to provide a singular objective lens to view the series' chronology through, then why do both of these official books emphasize how the timeline is a fluid concept still open to interpretation? When viewed within the context of an official defining source of information related to the Zelda series, this sort of non-committal language sounds extremely out of place. Though this all may come off as extreme cherry-picking, I feel the phrasing in these passages is indicative of the Zelda team's own attitude towards the timeline. There's reason to believe that this emphasis on how players could interpret the timeline differently is a reflection of the Zelda team's own feelings towards the Zelda timeline. The truth is, the timeline seen in Hyrule Historia is one of numerous iterations of the official Zelda timeline. While the Zelda team wouldn't publicize their internal timeline for many years, official statements heavily suggest that their idea of the Zelda timeline kept evolving and changing all the way up to Hyrule Historia's release. Shigeru Miyamoto, one of the original creators and producers of the series, once stated in a 2003 issue of Superplay that while the Zelda team does keep an internal document outlining how the games are connected, they aren't beholden to it. And this single quote is an encapsulation of how every Zelda game has been created since the very beginning. New and interesting gameplay ideas are prioritized first, with every other aspect of the game being shaped around that foundational pillar. As a result, the Zelda team's focus is not and has never been to expand or build upon the Zelda timeline, something that's been reiterated across several interviews. 4 years prior to the Superplay interview, Miyamoto expressed the same creative approach in the Japanese-exclusive Ocarina of Time encyclopedia, noting how it's inevitable that small inconsistencies will crop up in the series' stories. Keep in mind, only 5 Zelda games had been released by this point. Even after Miyamoto passed the role of series producer on to Eiji Aonuma, his own sentiment towards the series' focus mirrors that of Miyamoto. No matter where you look, the message always seems to be the same. While the Zelda team has clearly recognized how much fans enjoy trying to solve the Zelda timeline, actually following and building upon narrative elements established in other entries is a far lesser priority to them than creating a strong gameplay foundation. Tears of the Kingdom was a sequel to Breath of the Wild, not because they wanted to continue its story, but because the development team had too many leftover ideas and decided to further build upon its gameplay foundation. Majora's Mask was largely a sequel to Ocarina of Time because the development team heavily reused their work on Ocarina to finish the game in under a year, and even then, its actual narrative connection to Ocarina is pretty minimal. Many of these games are sequels either out of convenience or because the gameplay logically dictated they build off the gameplay of a previous installment. Now, this isn't to claim that the timeline or even the idea of a story in the Zelda series is a meaningless afterthought. While Miyamoto himself once mused that it'd be easier on the developers if fans just didn't care about the story, he's also acknowledged and highlighted the team's efforts to strengthen Ocarina of Time's connection to the series' other entries. Even in 1998, there was a sense that they couldn't betray either the series' identity or the expectations of fans. Do remember that this is Shigeru Miyamoto, the guy who, according to credible internet users, hates story in video games. While Miyamoto didn't personally write the stories for any of the Zelda games, his comments as a producer and initial director must have value if even he acknowledged how important continuity was at this early juncture of the series. To say that story or continuity don't matter in The Legend of Zelda would be demonstrably false. If that was true, the developers wouldn't go out of their way to maintain continuity between games or even bother with the idea of writing dialogue. However, the story of each individual game, and by extension their placement in the timeline, is never the focal point of the series' development. Moreover, as that initial quote from Miyamoto implies, the Zelda team has actively avoided writing games with the greater timeline in mind. Dan Osen, the English translator for 3 of the earliest games in the series, spoke about the Zelda timeline as early as 2001 on Nintendo's official forums, explaining that the fact is, there is not nor is there likely ever to be a unified Zelda story. The developers don't want to create a story that might limit their creativity in future games. It's that simple. And based on what little archives still remain from Nintendo's old online presence, this was a point that Dan reiterated time and again. While Dan was just an English translator for some of the series' earliest games, the series' continued focus on self-contained stories gives credence to his explanation. Even Ocarina of Time, arguably the biggest set story point in the series, as the nexus for Ganon's origin and the timeline split, was eventually superseded by Skyward Sword as the earliest chronological point in the series' timeline. Moreover, Osen's explanations regarding the timeline are further weighted through other comments made by the Zelda team, including ones made shortly before the release of Hyrule Historia. The Zelda team has historically been of the mindset that creating new games around a strictly defined chronology would severely limit the creative potential of the series' gameplay. In their minds, this restrictive approach would limit the gameplay and story to whichever point in the timeline they focused on, and to do so would require defining the timeline to begin with. While their concerns may come off as trivial, there does exist another series that almost single-handedly justifies the Zelda team's hands-off approach to the series' chronology. Another long-running series of action games that has a long-standing timeline of its own.
Dracula, die now and leave this world. You'll never belong here!
Over the series' 30-plus year history, the Castlevania games have managed to follow a fairly consistent timeline, even with a few revisions and retcons here and there. Unfortunately, the series eventually backed itself into a corner. Super Castlevania 4 established fairly early on that the series' main villain revives every 100 years, a small piece of lore that subsequent releases strictly adhered to. Between this and the eventual decision to officially reveal their own internal timeline, complete with exact dates, the series developers inadvertently limited themselves to how many new Castlevania games could take place across human history without breaking their own established rules and continuity. As a result, Koji Igarashi later admitted that he considers releasing the Castlevania timeline to the public as the single worst decision made regarding the series. Even if story was never the focus of Castlevania, its developers clearly wanted to maintain a consistent continuity. This eventually led to mounting difficulties in creating new games around fixed story elements, of which Castlevania had more than a handful. It's pretty clear that the Zelda team doesn't want to be similarly restricted by fixed story elements like this. While the Castlevania games did find clever ways to work around these particular restrictions, it'd have been much easier if they simply didn't write themselves into a corner to begin with. Setting up creative dead ends like this is why the Zelda series generally avoids establishing definitive rules or concepts that all subsequent entries must adhere to. It's how the series can get away with featuring so many different versions of time travel, among other recurring elements. The Legend of Zelda may have immutable story elements of its own, such as the basic rules governing the Triforce, but there was and will never be a strict set of rules that properly define concepts like the afterlife, reincarnation, or time travel. To do so would risk limiting the team's creativity by prioritizing the story over the gameplay, something that Aonuma himself has recognized as a potential issue. In essence, the Zelda team's approach to the timeline has been to focus on gameplay and let the games themselves shape the timeline, rather than the contrary. This approach completely avoids the issue seen in Castlevania, liberating the Zelda team to set new entries at any plausible point in Hyrule's history. However, their perception of the Zelda timeline as more of a loose narrative framework than a definitive sequence of events has led their internal timeline to face constant revisions throughout the 2000s. Though Link to the Past was often viewed as a prequel to the first two Legend of Zeldas, Shigeru Miyamoto actually claimed the contrary after Ocarina of Time's release, viewing Link to the Past as the chronological latest entry in the series at that point, a stance he doubled down on thereafter. Even Ocarina of Time's status as the chronological earliest story was contested, as Eiji Aonuma once stated in a 2004 interview that Four Swords was now considered to be the earliest story in the Zelda timeline, something not even suggested by the game itself. However, this little-known fact didn't stop Nintendo themselves from advertising Ocarina of Time as the series' origin story when it released on the Wii Shop channel in 2007. While this blurb doesn't come from the developers themselves, it is how the company overall continued marketing the game to a new audience. For a while, there was no further mention of the Four Swords series' placement in the timeline, until Aonuma's interview with My Games in 2011, in which he claimed that the original Four Swords had no relation to the timeline. This particular statement was made only 9 months prior to Hyrule Historia's release, which ended up confirming that the Four Swords trilogy is canonical after all. The fact that the Zelda team has played around so much with the series' chronology only emphasizes just how modular its individual stories are, given that a number of them could be swapped around with little regard for how that would change the history of Hyrule. Moreover, it shows how the developers view the Zelda timeline as a flexible concept. It isn't set in stone. It can be interpreted in any number of ways, as shown by their varying claims as the series progressed. All of this leads back to the timeline first presented in Hyrule Historia. While the book's English text refers to the timeline as the real history of Hyrule, the claim carries little weight due to how the developers themselves treat the very idea of an organized timeline as a creative inconvenience. If both Hyrule Historia and Zelda Encyclopedia are meant to be treated as major sources of canonical information, the timeline included, then what are the implications of there being so many accounts of the series' lead creators admitting they avoid building such definitive connections within the games themselves? Would that not support the non-committal language these books use when referring to the timeline? Knowing that the series developers would rather retain their creative freedom than to see it limited by such a strict timeline of events? Doesn't it matter that this fact hasn't changed in spite of the series being handled by different writers, directors, and producers over the years? Granted, this argument is easily countered by the simple fact that Nintendo released an official Zelda timeline to begin with. After all, the bulk of this argument thus far has been largely based upon information released prior to Hyrule Historia. While the Zelda series wasn't originally made with the idea of a definitive timeline in mind, it's possible that Nintendo could have simply changed their minds. It's not like they could walk back on the fact they've defined a clear chronological order to the Zelda series now. This would be a valid counter-argument had the series changed in any way as a direct result of the Zelda timeline's release. So why not challenge that notion? Let's assume the Zelda timeline was revealed under the pretense of establishing a more interconnected, overarching story. If so, there should be a clear shift in the narrative direction of every Zelda game released after 2011. The shift should be most obvious in A Link Between Worlds, the first release after Hyrule Historia. The game is a distant sequel to Link to the Past, set several centuries later. However, much like prior entries, its story is incredibly self-contained, treating the events of its predecessor as distant legend. Moreover, the game never reinforces the concept of the newly established downfall timeline in which it takes place, as the game instead focuses on the introduction of a parallel kingdom that mirrors Hyrule. Now, A Link Between Worlds does contain references to Ocarina of Time, adopting terminology and iconography of the sages in lieu of the Seven Maidens. But these references don't necessarily support the downfall timeline's existence, as the game's backstory has no mention of a hero who fell in a great battle against evil. Given that this same legend is comprehensive enough to correctly recount Ganon's origins as a mere thief, it's hard to believe that Zelda, having sealed Ganon away with the Triforce, wouldn't have memorialized the Hero of Time's sacrifice across Hyrule in some way. This legend also omits any mention of Ganon's alter ego, Aghanim, as Ganon himself is treated as the sole historical threat to Hyrule. This runs contrary to Link to the Past itself, in which few Hyruleans even knew of Ganon's existence, as he was sealed in the Dark World for ages. Now, you could pose the argument that such discrepancies exist because this backstory is a legend to the Hylians, and some details were forgotten as the story was retold over centuries. But if we're to believe that Hyrule Historia was meant to be a narrative tentpole for the games moving forward, then how exactly would this argument be in the book's favor? Consider the legend spoken of in Wind Waker, another direct sequel, and how accurately it recounts the events of Ocarina of Time, despite nearly all of Hyrule's culture and history being lost in the sea. If the contents of this book were intended as narrative anchors for the series, then why is A Link Between Worlds' record of past events a vague amalgamation of what transpired in its predecessors? If the games are meant to have stronger narrative connections to other entries now, then A Link Between Worlds' backstory should connect these games together more clearly. There's a clear difference between treating past events as mere myth and blurring them so heavily that it still leaves room for other interpretations. Furthermore, if the Zelda team was trying to adhere to a stricter timeline and treat the events of each game as fixed narrative points, then why retcon story elements like Ganon's destruction at the end of Link to the Past, instead claiming he was actually sealed away? If that was really the intention, then A Link Between Worlds should be more consistent with the events of its predecessor, rather than rewriting established canon. It's not as if retconning Link to the Past was necessary, given that there already exists precedent for Ganon being revived from the dead. While the official Zelda timeline was later revised to address a few of these discrepancies, the simple fact is that if the official timeline was meant to portray a fixed set of events that would be reflected in subsequent releases, this revision shouldn't have been necessary in the first place. This was then exacerbated by the release of Triforce Heroes in 2015. Initially, the game's timeline placement was actually undetermined when it was announced at that year's E3, so already its relation to the timeline wasn't even considered from the onset. Shortly after its release, the game was ultimately recognized as a direct sequel to A Link Between Worlds, even stated to follow the same link. This doesn't amount to much though, as Triforce Heroes' story is so bare bones and disconnected from every other game. Nintendo could have said it's actually a distant sequel to Twilight Princess and it'd make about as much sense. It has nothing to do with the rest of the series, and exemplifies Nintendo's gameplay-first design philosophy.
Really? That's a bad game? I thought it was pretty good.
Which leads into the release of Breath of the Wild, a game stated to take place so far into Hyrule's history that its relation to any other game is essentially meaningless. There's enough supporting evidence across the game suggesting its events could feasibly take place in any of Hyrule Historia's 3 timeline branches. Though Breath of the Wild does meaningfully build upon story elements introduced in Skyward Sword, such as the goddess Hylia and the spirit of the Master Sword, the game largely avoids tying itself down to the official Zelda timeline entirely, and that's not by coincidence. Eiji Aonuma noted that they intentionally avoided creating direct ties to earlier games in Breath of the Wild, as its main focus was to steer the series in a new direction and away from conventions it grew too reliant on, including the Zelda timeline. By this point, there is no reason to entertain the idea that Hyrule Historia's timeline was ever meant to be treated as a serious, defined chronology. If it was, then why would every game thereafter continue being developed as they were before, ignoring the implications of an overarching chronology? And if the games themselves somehow don't constitute strong enough evidence, surely what the developers themselves have to say does. In Breath of the Wild's art book, Creating a Champion, Aonuma further expanded on the decision to sidestep the timeline entirely, stating that, "If we defined a restricted timeline, then there would be a definitive story, and it would eliminate the room for imagination, which wouldn't be as fun. We want players to be able to continue having fun imagining this world even after they're finished with the game. So this time we decided that we would avoid making such clarifications." In a separate interview, when asked if the Zelda team was still interested in the timeline first outlined in Hyrule Historia, Aonuma reflected on the backlash, noting that, "History is always kind of imaginative. It's left to the person who writes the book, so that's how we approach it as well. It's not necessarily that we come up with a game and think, oh, this is where it fits in the timeline. Honestly, lately we're kind of scared to say exactly where things are in the timeline for that reason, but we like to leave things to the imagination most of the time." Despite the series' official timeline being formally revealed just 6 years earlier, Aonuma is clearly still hesitant about giving definitive answers related to it. His stance is perhaps most obvious in an August 2017 interview with YouTuber Sifano, in which Aonuma candidly lays out his thoughts on the official Zelda timeline. "When we start to work on a new Zelda, of course we think about all this timeline stuff. But honestly, when we start to think of a new Zelda, respecting the timeline is a constraint. We would like to be free to imagine whatever we want without having to worry about the timeline. Except now, when we think of a new idea, we have to wonder, okay, but where does it fit in the timeline? And it instantly becomes very complicated. And sometimes we can't do these new ideas because it wouldn't fit in the timeline. So for the creative teams, it's a hindrance. Yeah, we publish a timeline in a book, but among our staff, we would like to be able to stop thinking about it. When it comes to the Zelda timeline, I'm of the opinion that it's for the players to debate, and to imagine for themselves the order of events." Now, you could pose the argument that Aonuma's statement is actually evidence supporting the official timeline's relevance to the series, as it highlights the Zelda team's attempts to account for it now being public knowledge. In essence though, this quote remains consistent with the team's long-standing attitude towards the timeline, noting how much of a creative limitation it is, especially because it's public now. A Link Between Worlds alone is proof that, while the team continued to respect the series' long-standing continuity, they were more focused on creating interesting gameplay experiences than they were following fixed story elements. If anything, this statement further supports the decision to place Breath of the Wild thousands of years into Hyrule's future. It was a convenient way to sidestep the issue entirely. And if you were to look at any further comments on the Zelda timeline following Breath of the Wild's release, you would find the same overall sentiment. Even 12 years after revealing an official Zelda timeline, the developers have continued treating the timeline's relation to the series in the exact same way. If anything, the team has only grown more distant from their official timeline since it released, greatly downplaying its significance. Tears of the Kingdom even supports this notion. Breath of the Wild's artbook outlined how Calamity Ganon was once a Gerudo male known as Ganondorf from The Age of Myth, all but outright stating that Calamity Ganon was once Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time. Tears of the Kingdom, though, walks back on this, as it introduces a completely new Ganondorf to the series. Not only is this yet more evidence that the Zelda team isn't too committed to their own timeline, but this particular rewrite is something you'd only know if your main understanding of the series was strictly based off supplementary material such as this. It doesn't necessarily contradict the information presented within Breath of the Wild itself, because the series never changed its storytelling or world-building methods to accommodate supplementary materials such as the official timeline. It's entirely possible to play through the whole series and not even know Nintendo released an official timeline somewhere in the middle of it all. Nintendo even remade and remastered a number of the series entries after Hyrule Historia's release, and while they could have leveraged the opportunity to rewrite the stories of these games with the official timeline in mind, they were left completely untouched. They decided against following the trend of creating definitive versions of these games that could have better reflected the updated story and chronology, despite the opportunity clearly being there. No matter how you look at it, the official Zelda timeline introduced in Hyrule Historia is simply not relevant to the series itself. The developers haven't taken advantage of its existence, while continuing to approach the series in largely the same way, and even taking steps to avoid dealing with the official timeline entirely. Even the producer overseeing the entire franchise feels it's best for fans to focus more on their own interpretations than the established timeline. So if the official Zelda timeline doesn't matter, then what even is the point of it? Personally, I feel the emphasis that these books and various interviews place on player interpretation suggests that the official Zelda timeline wasn't necessarily meant to serve as the definitive Zelda timeline, but is instead the Zelda team's personal interpretation of the series' chronology. Though this sounds like a trivial distinction, the difference is huge. A definitive timeline would be an arguable fact and remove all ambiguity, cutting out a large part of the series that fans could continue to discuss. However, by framing and treating the official timeline as their interpretation of Hyrule's history, the developers are spared from being boxed in on future games, while fans are given the freedom to continue speculating and piecing Hyrule's history together for themselves. The Zelda team may have their own idea of how the series links together, but in their eyes, their interpretation seems to be no more valid than those of the fans. In more recent years, Aonuma and Fushibayashi have doubled down in emphasizing that players should come to their own conclusions regarding the series' story and mythos. They've begun referring to Hyrule's history with more parallels to how most of our own real-world history has been documented, gradually piecing together a timeline of events through any surviving evidence and basing our conclusions on that. With all that being said, I do think there's a certain logic to the official Zelda timeline that suggests it wasn't hastily thrown together. At least not entirely. The official Zelda timeline appears to be structured in service of two central ideas, that being that every Ganon seen in the series was once the Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time, and that the series' first 4 games have to directly follow Ocarina of Time. There may have been a point where the intent was for Ocarina to lead into Link to the Past, but after Wind Waker and Twilight Princess saw Ganondorf killed in both timeline branches, it wasn't possible to make that direct connection anymore. Hence the creation of a third timeline branch. It probably made more sense to invent another branch than to create a new game just to explain how these games directly connect to each other. To do so would require prioritizing the story over the gameplay, which would run contrary to the Zelda team's entire design philosophy. Ultimately, the Zelda team's insistence on prioritizing gameplay is what led the timeline to get so messy to begin with. There wasn't an ideal way to untangle it without directly going against their own design principles. The result isn't a perfect solution by any means, but this seems to be the basis upon which the official timeline was created. Though it begs the question of why Nintendo even decided to publish an official Zelda timeline if they never planned on treating it more seriously. That's also without touching on whether any part of the books themselves should be treated as definitive canon or glorified speculation, given that Hyrule Historia and Zelda Encyclopedia, while written with the approval and blessing of the series' creators, weren't directly written by them or any of the series' various creative teams. It differs from similar compendiums like the Gungrave Archives or Xenogears Perfect Works, which were written with direct input from those series' respective creative minds. Getting into all the inconsistencies the Zelda books introduce is way outside the scope of this video though. You'll just have to reach your own conclusions on that one. If there was ever a point where the developers had tried treating the timeline more seriously, we are far removed from it now. Following Breath of the Wild's release, Aonuma explained that its ambiguous place in the timeline was a means of stoking the imagination of fans, encouraging them to create their own ideas regarding the game's themes and history. Not only is that consistent with how most entries were already being handled, but I feel it's the right approach to have towards the series as a whole. The Legend of Zelda never really had the narrative foundation necessary to support an overarching storyline, which is part of what led the Zelda timeline to become such a huge point of contention to begin with. The series naturally lends itself to all these different interpretations of how the games link together into a sprawling, ceaseless battle of good and evil. This may have been an indirect result of Nintendo's overall design philosophy, but it's nonetheless become part of the series' appeal, one that the developers have clearly been aware of for years now. If the Zelda team didn't value the series' story or its chronology in some way, they wouldn't keep giving fans reasons to think about how every piece of the puzzle fits together, just as they did over 2 decades ago. In the end, the Legend of Zelda series will continue as it always has, and the recently released Echoes of Wisdom should serve as proof of that. Its overworld design intentionally evokes the geography of Link to the Past, even sharing some of the same locations. This greater emphasis on environmental callbacks heavily implicates Echoes of Wisdom as a successor to the Triforce of the Gods duology, but within the context of Nintendo's official timeline, it's a bit incongruous. Settlements of non-Hylian races like Gorons and Deku Scrubs can be found throughout the kingdom. The Great Deku Tree can be found with neither the Kokiri nor Koroks by its side, and the Triforce is referred to by a completely different name, a first for the series. Assuming that Echoes of Wisdom indeed follows the Triforce of the Gods duology, the only place it could reasonably fit into Nintendo's official timeline is immediately before Zelda 1, a game that shares none of these elements, thereby creating another inconsistency in the official timeline. And yes, before I could even finish this video, Nintendo confirmed this is exactly how Echoes of Wisdom fits into their official timeline. While it shows they haven't abandoned the official timeline, they've still done little to justify its existence. You could claim that the game's inclusion of a trident-wielding blue Ganon, returning locales like the Eastern and Desert Palaces, as well as its general topography all definitively link the game to the Triforce of the Gods duology, but I could just as well argue that Echoes of Wisdom is actually a sequel to Four Swords Adventures for the exact same reasons. Again, if Nintendo really cared about using the timeline as a basis for future releases, then there should be no room for such debates or inconsistencies. In fact, it should speak volumes that, in spite of its eventual placement in the timeline, Aonuma noted that they intentionally meant to obfuscate Echoes of Wisdom's place in Hyrule's history. So, for all the returning elements that Echoes of Wisdom iterates upon, the game avoids establishing a definitive connection to any other entry in the series, instead focusing more on its own original elements, and can thus be enjoyed as a purely standalone game. Were the official timeline truly so important, then it should be obvious where Echoes of Wisdom fits into all of this. But that's not really the point of the game. The focus is on the Echoes system, building upon the team's multiplicative gameplay philosophy that started with Breath of the Wild. Every aspect of Echoes of Wisdom was built off this gameplay foundation, just as the series has always done before. Nintendo will no doubt continue releasing revisions to their timeline, potentially shuffling games around and challenging existing theories about the series' chronology. The games themselves won't take this ever-shifting timeline into account, and will continue to stand on their own as purely self-contained experiences. The series will no doubt persist as it has for the past 4 decades, and that's perfectly fine. And no, this doesn't mean the Zelda team believes story and continuity are afterthoughts. In fact, more recent interviews should prove the contrary, that they still stress heavily to be mindful of prior games when creating new stories, in spite of the fact that they'd prefer to let fans speculate the finer details themselves. Look, writing off the stories of the Zelda series and saying the timeline is a made-up afterthought wasn't the point of this video, nor was it meant to deride the idea of interpreting them any differently. If anything, this video should serve as encouragement to think about the series independently of the official timeline and view the games in your own way. It's not as if the concept of a Zelda timeline can be refuted at this point. So long as there's a story and a shred of continuity in the series, none of these discussions will ever really end. Remember, it's like Aonuma himself said, history is always a bit imaginative. It's something left to the person who writes the book.